Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides and the cover art's a mess. There's so much here to tear apart. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Why I Hate This Album. I am one of your hosts, Garrett Harvey, not with me, as always, co-host extraordinaire, Timothy Richardson. Don't worry, folks, he's okay. Tim's just off doing Tim things, so you know what that means. It's time for a solocast. Now, this one's a special one, guys. This has taken me months to put together, and to be perfectly honest, I'm not even done yet. We have heard of Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family a number of times through the various songs and artists that we've covered here on the show, but neither Tim or I really knew the story. So I decided to take a deep dive. Now, I'm going to be honest, there's a lot less music involved in this story than usual, but man, is it interesting and complicated. So bear with me. This was easily the hardest one I've done so far because it's a really big story with a lot of people and a lot of facts that are hard to double check. So I hope you enjoy it. Tim will be back shortly, but until then, here it is, Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family.
They was selling that pure rock. BMF I been bossed up. Never been a type to talk much. You want your chain back on.
In the spring of 1968, newlyweds Charles and Lucille Flannery left Cleveland at the age of 21 for the jobs and culture of Detroit in the 60s. Shortly after making the move, Lucille gave birth to their first son, Demetrius, on June 21st, 1968. His brother Terry followed in 1972, and their sister several years later. To support his growing family, Charles typically had a couple of jobs on alternating shifts. He would work in a foundry for a few days, then either follow up as a maintenance man at a hospital, or pick up shifts at one of 3 auto factories. Among all his jobs, he enjoyed the carpentry he would do for the local churches the most. It brought him closest to God and the steel guitar that was played in the church band. Charles had longed to be a musician his whole life, a dream he had to put down at an early age when his own father became sick, and Charles went to work at a steel factory in Cleveland as a teenager. Charles still took time to learn on his own and excelled given his very limited instruction, but the realities of supporting a family didn't allow for him to pursue a career in music. However, he was able to set up a small studio in his basement, and when Demetrius, or Meech as he was known by his friends and family, was old enough, the two would play together in the church band, Dad on guitar and Meech on drums. Life was hard for the Flannery family. Raising a family on a series of unpredictable, short-term jobs wasn't easy and sometimes wasn't even possible. There were many days the kids came home to find the power or the gas had been turned off again, and we're talking about the middle of Detroit winter. Meech and Terry swore they would never be poor when they grew up, but they also understood that you don't get rich on minimum wage, and nobody was talking about college or 401ks in their house. So by 10th grade, Meech dropped out of school and was selling 8 balls of cocaine out of his parents' house. Friends of the family report that Meech's parents were weirdly supportive of their son's illegal activity. They appreciated that he was making money and not sitting around all day. 3 years into the drug game, at the age of 19, Meech saw his first arrest for a bag of weed and carrying a concealed weapon. This would be the first of many arrests where Meech would supply a fake name and fake driver's license. Names like Roland West, which Meech gave the police when he was arrested again 5 months later after that marijuana and gun charge. That same year, the first of Demetrius's daughters were born. He named her Demetria after himself, and then largely ignored her for most of her life. His second daughter came a year later, and he also pretty much abandoned her as well. I mean, allegedly. He moved away, didn't tell anyone where he was going, and never spoke to her again, so... While Meech was getting arrested and having children he paid no attention to, his brother Terry had taken a slightly different path. When Terry was a child, a bullet grazed his eye, and allegedly the surgery to repair it was screwed up, and he was given a settlement. Weirdly, I couldn't find any details about how that eye got grazed by a bullet, but apparently it did. When Terry came of age, he took his money and started a car service, and hired all of his friends as drivers. Terry's car service was doing well, but he felt like it could be doing even better. So he began putting large quantities of cocaine inside of those cars and then drove them to cities. Then, since it was the 90s, it wasn't long before Terry realized he could make even more money if he first took that cocaine, cooked it into crack, and then distributed the bricks of crack. For context, a $100,000 brick of cocaine could easily be turned into $200,000 of really good crack, depending on who you get your cocaine from. Terry continued to build his business in Detroit, while Meech moved to Atlanta to probably flee his children and mounting arrests. There, he quickly began making connections and building his own reputation as a new player in the drug game. It's believed somewhere around the mid-90s, a friend of the brothers named Wayne Waniac Joyner introduced them to a source who could supply them with Colombian dope delivered straight from Mexico. This was probably just Mexican dope, and the Colombia stuff was marketing, but it was still really high-quality cocaine. And even better, it was available in large quantities at wholesale prices. Through this source, the Flannerys would eventually be moving hundreds, and at times thousands of bricks of cocaine a month through the LA ports. But before they could handle that much volume, the brothers needed to recruit. Joining forces, Terry and Meech began buying cars, hiring couriers, and shady accountants to launder money through shell businesses run by stolen identities across 11 states. Carefully over a few months, the Black Mafia Family was born. Once the cocaine was brought to the U.S., usually through a port in Los Angeles, it would be picked up and taken to a local stash house to be counted, broken up into smaller quantities, and distributed to drivers. The drivers then load cars, vans, and limos that were outfitted with deoxygenated chambers, known as traps, with their load of cocaine and, at sometimes, cash. Not only were there secret compartments to store the drugs, but there was a series of actions and magnetic switches, all that had to be employed in a certain combination of movements in order to unlock these compartments. Think like rolling down the passenger window while turning on the AC and hitting the high beams. Naturally, less trusted drivers were given smaller cars with less product and would work with a handler at the destination to actually unlock the shipment. Only the most trusted drivers were allowed to drive the Lincoln Navigator limos and their 200-kilogram payload, and even that guy might not be told how to unlock the trap. If you're curious, if you do want to unlock the Lincoln Navigator limo to reveal its 200-kilogram payload of cocaine, you need to simultaneously pull the emergency brake, hit the rear defrost button, and open the moonroof, in case you ever find yourself in the position. The drivers then took the coke to labs and stash houses to be cut and stored. The labs were inconspicuous. An upper-middle-class home in a Detroit suburb, or a swanky townhome in the affluent Atlanta suburb north of downtown called Buckhead. Not the sort of places you'd expect millions of dollars of cocaine to be just sitting around. One of the labs also served as a part-time party house. It was a large compound south of Atlanta proper, and affectionately known by Meech and his crew as the White House, because it was, in fact, just a big white house. The labs within the homes were out of the way, well-guarded areas with special filtration systems in the AC to ensure that workers didn't enjoy their jobs too much. Their task was to take a kilogram and remove 1/8 of cocaine and replace it with a filler, usually this stuff called Procent liquid additive, that I did a lot of research on and it still remains unclear what that is. But, probably not something you want in your body. But the idea was that for every 7 kilograms you cut, you created a new kilogram, and all of them were still 90% pure, so no one was really going to notice. And even if they did, who were they going to complain to? At that rate, the operation was clearing about $5 million for every 1,000 kilograms that they processed, and each lab was moving a few hundred kilograms every month. Needless to say, they were already making tens of millions of dollars, and they were just getting started. Once cut, the cocaine then had to be transported to distributors in Atlanta, Detroit, New York, D.C., Missouri, Florida, North and South Carolina, Kentucky, Alabama, and Tennessee. The shipment is dropped off, cash is collected by the distributors, and driven back to the labs to be counted. Once counted, the cash is paid out to the drivers and managers, and the leftover cash is then used to buy more cocaine, and the whole thing would start over again. What's crazy is during those cash runs where a driver had no drugs in the car at all, they could be carrying as much as $9 million, and for all that risk, they would be paid as low as $1,000. The risk seemed so low that it was considered easy work and a great way to prove your loyalty and start working your way up the ladder. And there was a corporate ladder. From the start, the BMF was very different from its predecessors. Rather than ruling the organization through fear and intimidation, the brothers employed a much more corporate hierarchy, with Meech and Terry positioned as the co-CEOs. Also strange was, within the organization, there were 2 distinct crews, each run pretty much independently by each brother, with their own styles, lieutenants, sharing little more than a couple of drivers between them, and of course that source out of Mexico. Meech ran his crew as a magnanimous, hands-off leader. He was friends with everyone and never got his hands dirty. That was the job of his number 2, Chad J-Bo Brown. J-Bo was a details man and was trusted to manage the day-to-day, allowing Meech to avoid ever being around drugs, cash, or even give a direct order. The only time people in his crew besides J-Bo saw Meech was when he was partying at the club. Now, I'm about to list off a whole bunch of people, and I know you guys aren't sitting around taking notes, and that's fine. I just want to give you an idea of just how many people were involved in the leadership of these crews, and you're going to hear these names again, but I'll do my best to remind you who they are and how they fit into the story. Below J-Bo were Meech's top-level managers, Tito, Fleming, Barima McKnight, a Carson City rapper known as Blue Da Vinci, Marquis Baby Blue Dixon, a giant named Amin Bull Height, and Amari O-Dog McCree, an Atlanta coke dealer and a close friend of then unknown rapper Young Jeezy. Meech's brother Terry took a much more hands-on approach with his crew, showing up at the labs to check the count, often even being on site at various states to oversee drops himself. Terry figured if no one knew exactly where he was going to be, nobody would ever start slacking off for fear that the boss might show up. Though Terry seemed bookish and at times even generous, he was also manipulative and very petty. He would offer drivers new cars only to make them work it off through drug runs for which they would get zero payment and work off very little debt. Terry's number 2 was Arnold A.R. Boyd, a former driver who rose through the ranks when former number 2 Benjamin Blank Johnson went away on cocaine charges. Also in the inner circle was Derek Chiptooth Pegues, who kept an eye on Terry's Atlanta interests, William Trucker Turner, Marlon Welch, the adult son of Terry's longtime girlfriend Tanisa, and Eric Slim Bevins, a man Terry liked so much he gave him a Bentley for his birthday. Rounding out the crew was Terrence Short, who went by Texas Cuz, Michael Freak Green, Innocent 50 Cent Gerville, who looked vaguely like 50 Cent, Danny Dogman Jones, and Duran Wani Gatling, who would coordinate with a sister cocaine crew to the BMF, something I didn't even know was a thing and frankly sounds kind of adorable. It was actually through the kingpin of that sister cocaine crew, a guy named J-Rock, that Terry and Meech were introduced to a very important man named William Doc Marshall. Doc was the man who could obtain cars that seemed to be completely legal and registered to law-abiding citizens, both real and imagined, and then actually sell those cars to Meech and Terry to use as drug mules. Those cars, vans, and limos shuttling cocaine and cash all over the country, they came from Doc. After years of supplying cars for the brothers, Doc had to retire when one of his cars was pulled over and 12 kilos were found inside. Little did he know, his company, Exquisite Empire, had been under the microscope of the U.S. government long before that. But more on that later. Over the years, Doc became well-versed on the inner workings of the BMF and had become close friends with Meech. So, when he stepped back from Exquisite Empire, though not completely, the boys made him Chief Financial Officer of the BMF. He tracked costs, debts, looked for ways to invest and launder millions of dollars a month through bank accounts and small deposits that wouldn't attract attention. Doc was a natural and profits began to rise. Another perk to hiring Doc was he had a built-in relationship with drug dealers from his years of supplying them cars. And it wasn't long before Doc began to open up new distribution channels with local dealers in Atlanta, expanding the BMF's footprint even more. As the organization grew, the brothers ensured their rules were being followed. Unlike other gangs and drug cartels, violence for the sake of violence was not tolerated. It didn't make any sense to attract attention just to look like a tough guy. Also, if you get jammed up, you gotta take your heat, and you keep your mouth shut. The most important quality for all members of the BMF was loyalty. Desperate to show their devotion to the cause, many of the organization members, though mostly in Meech's crew, had the letters BMF tattooed down their forearm, intertwined with the crew's motto, Death Before Dishonor. With the operation in place and properly staffed, the next problem was success. The result of a successful cocaine empire is a whole bunch of cash, and none of it's very usable unless you can figure out a way to launder that money through a seemingly legitimate business. See, any purchase made in cash over $10,000 requires the seller to report it to the federal government. If the buyer has a habit of buying high-dollar items in cash, and the Flannery brothers did, and you have no discernible income, you're just begging for a visit from the IRS. One of the earliest solutions to this was the Michigan Lottery. One of Terry's distributors, quote-unquote, convinced a convenience store owner to set aside all of his winning scratch-off tickets ranging in value from $5,000 to $75,000. Terry would then buy those winning lotto tickets from the store clerk and hand them out to various girlfriends and their relatives. The women would then report their winnings to the IRS and then give the money to Terry or buy cars and houses with the clean cash and put it in their names, but it was really Terry's. What's more interesting to me is not the scam itself, but the fact that there were women for years reporting somewhere between $30,000 and $100,000 in scratch-off winnings per year at the exact same store, and no one from the IRS found that strange. But the lotto scam was only helpful for walking around money and maybe a car or two. It wasn't nearly large enough to funnel the millions of dollars the brothers were making per month. So CFO Doc Marshall began looking for ways to diversify their earnings. This was done by using associates with a consistent work history and no criminal background as puppet accounts for their money. Small amounts of money would be added consistently to these accounts, and then the money was then used to fund legal real estate purchases and fund both legitimate and not so legitimate businesses. Through illegal means, the Flannerys actually funded the creation of jobs for dozens, if not hundreds of people in completely legitimate businesses. The downside was it also employed several hundred more people in very illegal businesses, specifically trafficking and sale of cocaine. So, kind of a mixed bag. With that kind of money, both brothers lived incredibly opulent lives of luxury, matched only by the world's most famous musicians, actors, and maybe tech bros some years later. But at the time, they would rub elbows with not just the Atlanta elite, but they would jet set across the country and attend all of the coolest parties, attended by all of the most famous people you and I know. Eventually, Terry settled down in LA with his girlfriend Tanisa. Being hands-on as he was, it made sense to be where the shipments were arriving to make sure that things started off on the right foot. He bought 3 houses, all hidden behind gates or hedges, and all of them in Tanisa's name. To people in Los Angeles, Terry's lifestyle didn't seem that strange. The fact that he took private jets to parties hosted by people like P. Diddy just made everyone think he was probably in the music industry. No one thought twice about seeing limousines snaking up his long driveway to his unassuming split level every few days. They just assumed he was hosting other A-listers. In reality, that house was a hub to meet the connect after a pickup, and those limos were packed with hundreds of kilos of product, and no one even lived at the house. Coincidentally, or maybe not, the split level known as The Jump was just down the road from J-Rock, the head of the Sin City Mafia, a drug ring with close ties to the BMF, and the same gentleman that had introduced the brothers to Doc, their current CFO. Terry, unsurprisingly, lived in the nicest of his 3 homes, a $2.9 million bungalow built into the hillside on the coveted Mulholland Drive. From there, he would look over the valley and picture his cocaine beginning its journey as it flowed from LA to Meech in Atlanta. Before the brothers arrived, the cocaine supply in Atlanta had been controlled by a group known as the Miami Boys, but in the early 90s, they were taken down by the federal government, leaving rival dealers to fight over a very limited supply at hiked-up prices. Instead of trying to take over with force or violence, the brothers took the Walmart approach. Their competitive advantage was that their connection was nearly endless and straight from Mexico. So they sat down with all the major dealers in Atlanta and offered them a reliable supply at low prices. Sure, the BMF made a little less per kilo, but they made up the difference in volume, and it wasn't long before they squeezed out all their competition. Also in the late 90s, Atlanta became a hub for the national hip-hop scene, fueled by the proliferation of the mixtape culture. Homemade CDs, these mixtapes were sold, traded, and given away at clubs and street corners by up-and-coming artists. The immediacy of the format allowed artists to constantly be putting out new material, starting new feuds with other rappers, or responding to a diss track days after its release. It wasn't long before radio stations picked up what was popular, and rappers like Jeezy, T.I., Lil Jon, and Ludacris all began appearing on mainstream radio. While his product flowed from a drug corridor called Boulevard deep in the low-income neighborhood known as the Bluffs, Meech was on the other side of town in the clubs of affluent Buckhead, watching and planning his move into the world of music. In the early 2000s, Meech still kept to himself in the clubs. He quietly sipped his drink with a knowing look on his face, but he also had a reputation as a man quick to violence when tested. Anyone who knew Meech or knew of him had heard the stories. One such story takes place at a strip club. But not just any strip club. This is the world-famous Magic City. Luxury cars line the parking lots, artists will drop new tracks for their celebrity friends, while impossibly beautiful women perform aerobatic and dance performances, the likes of which most of you listening can't even conceive of. There's reports of dancers making between $8,000 and $10,000 in a single night. Granted, Drake or Rihanna is going to need to be there for that kind of money to get spent, but it did happen on a fairly regular basis. One night, Meech was partying at the club, but by no means a high roller yet, when he got into an argument with another patron. Next thing you know, there were allegations that Meech may or may not have thrown a bottle and cut the guy's neck. The police were called, and Meech was arrested as Ronald Ivory, since that was the name on his fake driver's license. A month later, the assault charges from the incident were dropped, though it's not clear if that was because they couldn't find an actual person named Ronald Ivory, or if they just didn't press any charges. It should also be noted that Magic City did not ban Meech for the incident. In fact, they welcomed him back with open arms. Meech stayed out of trouble until a couple of years later when he was coincidentally at a house that was being raided as a suspected drug storage facility. It wasn't one, and it certainly wasn't one owned by the BMF, but Meech was arrested anyway and charged with possession of marijuana and obstruction. This time he was booked as Rico Seville, an alias he had been using since he lived in Michigan. Unfortunately, shortly after being released, and with a little help from the DEA, the police were eventually able to trace Rico's fingerprints back to Ronald Ivory and eventually to Meech himself. With the police out looking for him and the DEA beginning to sniff around, Meech disappeared completely from all public life. Occasionally, he'd be arrested on some petty crime, but was always released before the police could figure out the man they had was not who he claimed to be. During this time, he became a legend among criminal informants. Law enforcement would hear stories about Meech crisscrossing the country with over 200 kilos in the car, building a crew and strengthening his drug empire. Though nobody had any actual proof of this, or if they did, they sure as hell weren't sharing it. They all feared Meech, or at least his legend. They believed a terrible fate awaited anybody who dared cooperate with an investigation against him. Finally, and seemingly out of nowhere, in 2003, Meech re-emerged in Atlanta, and he was not hiding from anybody. He became a regular at all the hottest clubs in the city, or at least the ones he didn't get banned from for fighting, and suddenly he was the center of attention. He threw around stacks of cash and was surrounded by an entourage, sometimes with as many as 100 men, all with a cult-like allegiance to him. Also of note is the attire when Meech returned to public life. Members of his crew were all wearing the same black t-shirt with the letters BMF printed across the front. The Black Mafia Family was going mainstream. Of course, not just on their shirts, but tattooed on their biceps and, most importantly, hung around their necks were chains with the same 3 letters. Diamonds methodically arranged into BMF. I say most importantly because these chains came to symbolize the health of the organization and each member's standing within it. Those early chains were quickly replaced by larger ones, and the trend only got more ridiculous by 2003. Eventually, a full-time jeweler was employed, but not just any jeweler, but the king of bling, Jacob Arabo. He was the go-to chain designer for the likes of Jay-Z, P. Diddy, Kanye West, and now the BMF. Of course, buying jewelry that expensive isn't easy when your only income is through illegal cocaine sales. Luckily, Jacob the Jeweler, as he was dubbed by Jay-Z, didn't always remember to file the IRS federal form for cash purchases over $10,000. It was sort of a win-win situation. When he couldn't swing that, the brothers would usually just have a friend or an associate with a legitimate job buy the piece for them, a decision several of them would later come to deeply regret. By this point, both brothers had developed friendships with up-and-coming rappers and hip-hop royalty alike. It turns out endless wealth and a penchant for making a scene at the club is a pretty easy way to meet other insanely wealthy people who also like attention. Now, when I say friends, let me just give you an example. When Terry would go to New York to, let's say, get a new chain, which was often, P. Diddy's cousin, Papa, would be paid $2,000 a day to drive him anywhere he wanted to go. And I do mean anywhere. P. Diddy's cousin would drive Terry Flannery shopping, to get a sandwich, go watch the leaves change on a drive through Connecticut, literally anything. The two spent so much time together and got along so well, eventually Terry asked Papa to move to Atlanta and come work for him at an exotic car dealership he partially owned called 404 Motorsports. So Papa moved his wife and kids for the opportunity to stop being a driver and go work at an exotic car store. But the opportunity was of course not as advertised. As the story goes, Papa's job was to drive the cars from Atlanta to Detroit and LA and then back, all the time thinking he's just working transportation for a high-end car broker. That was until the day when he dropped off a car to BMF CFO, Doc Marshall, and Doc asked, "Hey, how do you unlock this thing?" Confused, Papa showed him the keys. After what I suspect was a tense but also kind of hilarious exchange, Doc called BMF manager Slim to get the combination. Papa was shocked when Doc unlocked the secret compartment to reveal a not small amount of cocaine lining the inside. Without a lot of other options, Papa kept working for Terry, and eventually he even became a lead distributor for his crew out of New York. So when I say that he was close with famous people, I mean he employed their family members and drew them into a web of, international drug trafficking. Good friends. Terry used this car broker cover, as well as referring to himself as a music producer, to explain to people why he was so successful when they asked what he did for a living. When Meech reemerged in Atlanta, with his entourage, exotic cars, stacks of cash, and general antics, he seemed to have forgotten what got him where he was. He was breaking the cardinal rules of the BMF. He was attracting attention for attention's sake. And eventually, it caught up to him. Around 4 a.m. on November 11th, 2003, Brian Alt, owner of the club Chaos, was closing out the registers from the always lucrative hip-hop night when a waitress ran in and said something bad had happened. When he ran out to the parking lot, he saw 2 men lying on the ground bleeding out from gunshot wounds as a security guard and 2 off-duty EMTs tried to keep them alive. The 2 victims were a man named Wolf Jones, P. Diddy's former bodyguard, and his friend Riz. Wolf had been asked to leave some 3 hours earlier from the club after getting aggressive with a woman, and he did so without any protest. He had apparently come back to settle a score and was killed. His friend Riz came to his side to give aid and was also shot with a gun lying by his side. When APD Detective Mark Cooper arrived at the scene, police were combing the lot for clues, but despite numerous people standing around, no one seemed to have seen anything. The eerie silence among the corralled witnesses was a phenomenon that would soon become familiar. The first real break of the night came when fellow detective J.K. Brown had a call forwarded to her phone from a supposed witness. The woman said, quote, "They have a lot of money. They have a lot of drugs. You don't know what you're getting yourself into." And the shooter goes by the name Meechy, and hung up. A couple of hours later, the police also learned, as Wolf and Riz were dying in the Grady Memorial Hospital trauma ward, 2 men on the other side of town were being admitted to North Fulton Regional Hospital for gunshot wounds. That morning, they picked up Amin Bull Height, who had been shot in the foot, and Demetrius Meech Flannery, who had been shot in the butt. They took them to police headquarters for questioning. Eventually, Bull was let go, but Meech was asked to stick around. He didn't seem concerned that he was being questioned about a murder, and provided curiously vague answers to simple questions like, "Where do you live?" Not to mention, the only witness in the case said that a man named Meechy done it, and here sat a man that goes by the name Meech. Despite continuing to stonewall them, the police were confident in their evidence, and Meech was charged with the murder of Anthony Wolf Jones and Lamont Riz Gertie. Even worse was that a murder charge meant search warrants, which might not have been such a big deal since Meech didn't have his name on any of the properties that he actually lived in, if not for DEA Special Agent Jack Harvey. Agent Harvey had been aware of Meech going all the way back to 1997. An informant had claimed Meech was the gunman in the highway shooting of a man named Dennis Walker, and he was reputed to be the associate of Detroit gangster Thelman Stuckey, a violent and all-around a not nice guy. I did a whole bunch of research into this guy, but it didn't really fit into the story. You want to read about a horrible gangster, Google Thelman Stuckey. But for this story, we have to continue. A few weeks before the shooting at Chaos, Agent Harvey had actually been sitting outside the famed White House, aka the Lab and Party House, during Big Meech's birthday party. He had lost track of Meech until he reemerged in Atlanta, and very soon after that, Harvey began to hear about the famous White House filled with guns and drugs and a frequent hangout of Big Meech. With a handful of criminal informant statements, including ones from the party itself, Agent Harvey sought a warrant to search the White House in connection to the highway shooting. But the evidence was flimsy and the judge wouldn't sign off on the warrant. But now with fresh murder charges and every reason to believe Meech lived in the White House, including the actual invitation to the party to celebrate his birthday, which had been made to look like a CD jewel case complete with liner notes, it was pretty easy to convince a judge to sign a warrant to go and look for the murder weapon. On November 17, 2003, Agent Harvey led a search team into the home. Aside from the very expensive furniture and excessive use of marble, what stood out most was the artwork. The master bedroom and office featured 3 framed photographs of Al Pacino. They were all screen grabs from various scenes of Scarface. There were 2 photos of the Gambino family crime boss John Gotti, a portrait of Tupac Shakur, and a photo of Christopher Notorious B.I.G. Wallace. More predictable things were also found during the search, including a police scanner, several $100,000 worth of BMF medallions, 3 loaded guns in various rooms, and most interestingly, a red spiral notebook. That notebook contained columns titled things like airline ticket, car notes, money owed, money paid, first run, Cali run, 2 nights, cell phone, and several other cryptic things. The nicknames and tallies in the notebook seemed random and would have been completely impossible to decipher, if not for one very lucky coincidence. One of the members of the search party was Detective Bryant Bubba Burns, who had spent his first year on the Atlanta Organized Crime Unit investigating a car ring called Exquisite Empire that was buying cars for drug dealers. The same Exquisite Empire that Doc Marshall, BMF's CFO, happened to own. Even crazier was that Detective Burns had recently caught an even bigger break a few months earlier when Doc shot and killed a would-be robber in his own home. When the police arrived, they found a man shot dead outside of a room-sized safe with a single kilo of cocaine sitting on the floor. This was enough for Burns to get a search warrant, and he was able to seize enough paperwork to finally understand how Doc was laundering money and identities to purchase cars for drug dealers. Now standing in the White House, he was looking at a notebook that had a lot of the same notations as the paperwork for Exquisite. Even more interesting was that many of Exquisite's employees were registered to cars in the Red Ledger, 19 to be exact, meaning that Exquisite was supplying cars to Meech and Terry's operation, though it wasn't entirely clear how. Also in the notebook was a list of phone numbers, a half dozen of which belonging to people who were in regular contact with people under wiretap surveillance in Detroit for a completely separate DEA investigation of the Puritan Avenue Boys drug gang. Rounding out the search in the home study, the investigators found an electric money counter, several bags of rubber bands, and a stack of business cards with the name Terry Flannery and the company 404 Motorsports. But more on that later. What they didn't find was a murder weapon, or really any evidence at all that tied Meech to the Chaos shootings. The woman who initially called and fingered Meechy as the shooter wouldn't give her name and refused to testify for fear of retaliation. Without a weapon or a witness, the case wasn't even brought before a grand jury. Meech's lawyer argued that his client was actually the victim, having sustained a shot in the ass while fleeing a violent situation. The evidence was weak and it looked like Meech was going to beat the charges, but the search of the White House had invited more attention and provided vital insights into the operation of the BMF to investigators, a fact that was not lost on his brother, Terry Flannery. The brothers had always practiced discipline and loyalty, and that's why they had been successful. But Meech's recent partying and needless violence ran opposite to everything they had built. The Chaos shootings drove a wedge between the brothers that couldn't be undone. By 2004, Terry was in LA confiding to friends over the phone that he was worried he might be under investigation for drug trafficking. He had always known a short stint in prison was always possible, if not likely, in his line of work, but felt that he had kept things segmented such that it wouldn't reveal the larger game at play. But the kind of attention Meech was bringing brought charges with sentences in the 20 to 30-year range, a reality that Terry openly admitted he could not face. The irony was that by this point, most of the time Terry was talking about this stuff, the DEA was already listening. Here's why. Prior to Meech's incident at Chaos, an investigation into the St. Louis chapter of the BMF was granted a wiretap. Through that wiretap, a slow chain of connections began to form. As a new number was detected up the chain, a new wiretap would be granted. Eventually, this pattern led to 3 burner phones Terry was using, and 3 new wiretaps were issued. Now, I'm glossing over hours and hours spent gathering evidence for the sake of time, but just know they didn't just get a wiretap on the CEO of the BMF. It took years and dozens of people working for hours on end. But by 2003, they did have it, and Terry was talking. Granted, he wasn't outright admitting to anything, but he was confessing to being worried about being found guilty as a drug trafficker, a thing that most of us don't regularly worry about, unless, you traffic drugs. For all his discipline, Terry was weirdly loose on the phone. He didn't speak directly about crimes, but it wasn't hard to understand what he was talking about. The one guy investigators never heard on the phone was Meech. He didn't call anybody. A month after the Chaos shooting, it was actually Terry who confirmed that he and Meech still weren't talking. Terry confided to his friends he was worried that Meech's crew was filling his head with crazy ideas and trying to turn him against him. After almost a decade of growth and prosperity, the BMF was beginning to show its first real cracks. Lucky for Meech, he had begun to turn his focus to new pursuits. In the early 2000s, Meech had formed BMF Entertainment, a dual-purpose company that could serve as a front to launder millions of dollars and a legitimate business with real artists signed to the label. Meech had always planned to make his way into the music business, but he wanted to use his money and reputation in the drug game to become a legitimate player immediately. BMF Entertainment's first big artist launch was for a straightforward gangster rapper and BMF member from Carson City going by the name Blue Da Vinci. As the sole investor and CEO, Meech poured millions into making Blue look the part. He paid for clothes, jewelry, cars, music videos, production crews, and all of his studio time. Even when Meech was under house arrest for the Chaos killings in 2003, he was paying for parties after parties after parties with hundreds of guests, making sure that other up-and-coming rappers like Ooh Wee and Young Jeezy were there to make it look like his guy was just as legitimate. Meech figured if he could make Blue look like he was already a successful rapper, maybe everyone would just assume he was and buy his music. Blue did his part too. He was a good showman. The problem was he just wasn't a great rapper. By the summer of 2004, when the $500,000 music video for Blue's single, We Still Here, bankrolled by Meech of course, debuted, the response was underwhelming. Instead, everyone was talking about a friend of Blue and Meech's going by the name Young Jeezy. Young Jeezy Jenkins grew up in the South, eventually settling in Macon, Georgia in his teens, where he was affiliated with the local Crips. If Atlanta was the big leagues, Macon had become the AAA ball of the rap game, sort of a farm league for the Buckhead clubs. Jeezy began rapping there as Little J and found fame in the local mixtape scene. By his 20s, he was a big fish in a small pond and made his way to Atlanta. Jeezy spent a lot of time on Boulevard, the main drug artery of the city, inspired by the hustle and struggle of life in the Bluffs. He became friends with dealer and BMF member O-Dog, who introduced him to his boss, Big Meech, and it wasn't long before Jeezy's mixtapes found their way into the Rolls Royces and Lamborghinis of the BMF. Jeezy didn't sign to BMF Entertainment. Meech was way too late to the party for that. Jeezy had his own company called Corporate Thugs, selling hundreds of mixtapes, a production company releasing his street album. He had a solo contract with Def Jam Records, and he was part of a collective called Boys in the Hood, which had signed a deal with P. Diddy's Bad Boy Entertainment. But none of that mattered to Meech. He claimed, and I do believe this, that he wanted to use his drug money to raise people out of poverty through legitimate means. Meech would loan Jeezy cars and jewelry for video shoots, pay DJs to play his singles, and he even appears in Jeezy's first major label single, Over Here, where he can be seen pouring bills down a dancer's chest. Now, some people point to this as the first recorded example of people making it rain, and the BMF claims they actually invented the practice. For anyone not familiar, this is where you take a giant stack of cash and throw it down on a person or crowd, hence making it rain money. This would happen often at Jeezy shows, and Meech and his crew were on stage, for some reason, during many of these concerts, and so they might be right. Unfortunately for his music label, Meech's friendship and support did more to raise the profile of the BMF than it did BMF Entertainment. Meech had become a consistent presence, and so was his crew. $50,000 chains and dozens of free Meech t-shirts can be seen on any video footage from a Jeezy concert from that time. The shirts themselves had been printed when Meech was on house arrest for the Chaos killings, but then became sort of a fashion thing. By June of 2004, with all that murder business behind him and the charges dropped for the Chaos killings, Meech decided to throw himself another completely insane birthday party. He rented the entire 25,000 square foot club, aptly named Compound. The club was actually two buildings, one with a dance floor surrounded by TVs, the other featured a loft with an elevated bed and movie projector. The club's courtyard, which could hold 1,000 people on its own, was accented by a Zen garden and 40-foot pool. This was the type of place that got rented out for very fancy corporate parties and not recently accused murderers / active drug kingpins. But it wasn't enough for him to just rent the club. He also had 6-foot letters installed in the courtyard spelling out his name. He had BMF Entertainment's logo carved into a 6-foot ice sculpture, and, of course, he had women with painted-on bikinis. But none of that was the true showstopper of the party. That honor belonged to the $100,000 in rented wildlife. In Meech's defense, the party's theme was Meech of the Jungle, so, he kinda had to deliver. And no, that's not a lame joke. I've seen the invitation. It actually said that. Anyway, guests were greeted in the courtyard by an elephant, a couple zebras, an ostrich, and 2 very big lions, luckily caged. As Meech saw it, this wasn't some self-indulgent mega flex to show everyone just how much money he had, which of course it was. He claimed he had to do these things in order to promote his label. But without a roster of hit artists, or really any hit artists at all, Meech was basically trying to Bloomberg his way into becoming a respected music label, and it wasn't working. Not found at the party was his brother Terry. The two were still feuding, and the rift was only growing. Terry thought Meech was caught up in his own hype, and so removed from the actual business, he forgot that he wasn't a record mogul. And when you go throwing giant parties that are written about in the newspaper, someone in the government might ask, hey, how's that guy paying for all that? And Terry was both right and wrong. Someone was asking that question, but it started way before the party. By the time of the party, DEA agent Jack Harvey and Detective Burns had teamed up since the search at the White House and were sitting in a van outside compound gathering as much information as possible about the attendees. Meanwhile, in response to Meech and his crew's ridiculous behavior, Terry was becoming even stricter and more disciplined with his crew, except for one glaring hole: the telephone. Where Meech never talked on them, Terry thought if someone was listening, and they were, then they would never be able to solve his incredibly clever code words. They did. When you have code words like pants for cocaine and dime for 10 kilos and A-Town for Atlanta, then the sentence, "please bring a dime of pants to A-Town," isn't that hard to decipher, especially if you assume the person that you're listening to is a drug trafficker. Terry was bringing just as much attention and a lot more specifics about the BMF than Meech ever could. He was way too hands-off. He didn't even know that much about his business. When the brothers split, Terry got most of the houses, even in Atlanta, so Meech had to buy new properties to set up as drop houses. He bought a gated home in Buckhead, a horse ranch in an anonymous Atlanta suburb, and a place they all called the Elevator, which was actually a swanky townhouse named so for a glass elevator inside. Meech quickly built out his new operation in Atlanta and turned his attention back to promoting his label. This time he bought billboards all over town that said BMF Entertainment Inc. The world is BMF's, in a very clear nod to the film Scarface. Once again, Meech's attempt to bring attention to his label and not his national drug empire completely backfired. No one saw the entertainment part of the signs, and even if they did, no one knew what the hell BMF Entertainment was. People just assumed drug dealers were now openly advertising and possibly threatening to take over the city. The ads were so audacious that they even got the attention of Fulton County Assistant District Attorney Rand Sheehy. At the time, Sheehy had been working in the narcotics unit for 2 years and had developed a somewhat negative reputation for how closely he worked with the APD narcotics detectives. While some of his colleagues saw it as a conflict of interest, Sheehy seemed to view access to the cops as a perk. He rode with them when they executed search warrants, he was on site for their stings, he even carried a gun for some reason that was not clear at the time and remains unclear now. Frequently, Sheehy would wrap up a long day and grab a few beers with a couple of cops. He'd provide broad legal guidance to the cops and they would tell him all the rumors about the streets. Over those 2 years, Sheehy had heard plenty of rumors about the BMF, but up to that point, they hadn't had a single indictment against the crew. No one ever spoke out against BMF or Meech. But when one of his buddies claimed the BMF were now buying billboards to advertise, Sheehy had to see it for himself. So he drove down I-75 to the south side of the city to learn what this ad was all about, only to realize it was for a record label with a very similar name and likely funded with the sale of drugs. The BMF were officially on his radar, and Sheehy wanted to help bring him down. Lucky for him, the guy on the Atlanta police force with the most amount of knowledge about the BMF was his best friend, Detective Bryant Bubba Burns. Burns is the same guy who had been investigating Doc's Exquisite Empire company that was buying cars and it turns out homes as well, using stolen and puppet identities for drug dealers since as early as 2001. His work on that case had gotten him assigned to a multi-agency federal task force whose sole purpose was to take down drug kingpins. Agent Harvey wasn't a formal member of the task force, but because of his deep knowledge on the BMF and Meech, he assisted when possible. That's how Burns and Harvey both ended up at the search for the White House after the Chaos killings. They quickly began comparing notes, and it was clear the Flannery brothers, Doc Marshall, and the BMF were all tightly connected. By late summer 2004, when the task force had its first formal briefing, Burns and Harvey were the resident experts with Assistant DA Sheehy quickly working to catch up. He also wasn't a formal member of the task force, but was eager to assist and offered to serve as the liaison to the DA's office, helping to fast-track warrants and hopefully wiretaps, should the need arise. The task force had one goal: infiltrate the BMF, and they planned to do it the old-fashioned way. Arrest a low-level dealer, flip him, and begin moving up the ladder from there. But before they could do that, a BMF associate would have to make a mistake, and until they did, all they could do was watch and gather as much information as possible. On the night of July 24, 2004, a legendary Midtown club called the Velvet Room was celebrating its final night of business, and the place was packed well after last call. The club was mostly filled with celebrities of the Atlanta hip-hop scene and VIP club regulars. Also in attendance that night were aspiring rappers and brothers Prince and Rashaka, who everybody called Tattoo, Drummond. They had gone there with their cousin and a few friends, hoping to network and be seen by all the right people. The plan didn't really work. The guys went to the club, got in, had a whole bunch of fun, but nobody made any real professional relationships at that party. At the end of the night, as things wound down and people began to mill out slowly, they left the club in staggering groups. The parking lot was gridlocked with Lamborghinis and other high-end sports cars as they left in a choreographed pattern. Prince was standing in the parking lot talking to his cousin Jamar when a Porsche SUV slowly began backing into him. A little drunk and not the least bit out of line for saying so, Prince knocked on the side of the car and said, "Yo, homeboy, you hitting me." The driver emerged from the car instantly, followed by at least 4 other men. He postured up to Prince, getting in his face and shouting, "What do you think you're doing? Y'all motherfuckers don't ever touch my car again." And that could have been the end of it. But somebody, and almost certainly Prince, replied, "You aren't running nothing." The men turned and moved together and without hesitation. Prince, his cousin, and 2 friends were swarmed with fists, stomps, and broken Cristal bottles. Watching 10 feet away was Jamil, their ride home. Seeing his friends being pummeled, he pulled the Glock from his glove compartment and fired 2 warning shots into the air. They were answered quickly with 2 more shots, followed by screeching tires, and the procession of fancy cars were gone. The 2 friends were beaten and bruised, but mostly fine considering the barrage they had just taken. Jamar, Prince's cousin, had been savagely beaten but was alive. He would later awake in the ambulance and attempt to fight both the EMTs and the hospital staff, believing he was still being attacked, before going into a 28-day coma. Prince had also been badly beaten, but even worse, he had been shot twice, rupturing his heart and liver. Prince's friends watched from the back of squad cars as a sheet was placed over their friend until the coroner arrived. Atlanta homicide detective Mark Cooper arrived at the club a little after 4 a.m. to find a very familiar sight. Shots fired, dead people in the parking lot of a club, and dozens of silent people who swear they didn't see anything. He had seen the same thing when he was investigating the shootings outside the Chaos Club some 8 months prior. Eventually, the police, with some goading from Prince's mother, convinced the boys to come in and provide their statements, but none of them would name a gunman, and all of them refused to testify for fear of retribution. Prince's mother told detectives that she had been contacted on behalf of the BMF, explaining that her son's death had been an accident, and that if she would just cooperate with them, and not the police, she'd be compensated quite handsomely. Prince's mother immediately told the police, but a grieving mother's claim of bribery wasn't going to get anyone arrested. They needed a witness or a weapon, and they didn't have either. The day after the Velvet Lounge shootings, BMF Chief Financial Officer William Doc Marshall got a call from a really pissed off Terry Flannery. Terry wanted to know who was running around shooting people for no reason and what Meech was planning to do about it. The shooter had been a high-ranking member of the BMF, which only made the violence more confusing to Doc and Terry. They both agreed the man should have known better. According to Doc, the beating was over and the men were half in their car when the warning shots had been fired by Prince's friend. None of the men were concerned. They had been around long enough to know the difference between a warning shot fired into the air and a gun fired in their direction. Curiously, the gunman got back out of the car, casually walked over to Prince, stood over him, and shot an almost lifeless man point blank. Usually the worst that would have happened in a situation like this is the kid would have been jumped, but nothing serious. The fact that 4 of them had been beaten and it ended with a murder was not the BMF way. It was sloppy and needless and the fastest way to get the attention of law enforcement. Before I can tell you more about the BMF, we need to take a step back. I want to tell you guys a little bit more about a different gang, and that story begins with 2 men. Scott King and Tremaine Kiki Graham met while Kiki was a student at Clemson University in the mid-90s. Scott had attended nearby Mars Hill College on a full scholarship for basketball, and the 2 had a lot in common. Well, actually the 2 had basically 2 things in common: a love for basketball and trafficking cocaine. But they really loved those 2 things. Scott had started selling drugs as a summer job before he eventually dropped out of college in his senior year to go full-time. One of his biggest customers was in Greenville, South Carolina, and Kiki was a distributor for that customer. Eventually, when Scott was pinched picking up 12 kilos, he did a 3-year stint at a state facility, never revealing a single name for time off of his sentence, and this was a guy that knew some names. When he got out, Scott moved to Atlanta in 1998. There, he coincidentally ran into Kiki at a club, and it was clear that Kiki was still in the game and doing quite well. Kiki had appreciated Scott's silence when he got picked up and gave him a $10,000 thank you. And not long after the 2 had reconnected, Kiki's supplier ripped him off, and Scott was all too willing to help make some introductions to his connections. The 2 decided to go into business together, and for about a year they were doing great. But it was obvious that they were leaving money on the table, and they went in search of a bigger supplier. Since you can't exactly put an ad on Craigslist to find a high-volume cocaine supplier, it can be a bit of a difficult and stressful process. But this was 1999 Atlanta, so it was actually quite simple. Kiki's girlfriend at the time was chatting up another woman in her apartment complex when that other woman mentioned that her boyfriend might be able to help them out. That boyfriend was a guy by the name of Jerry J. Rock Davis, who happened to be the kingpin of the Sin City Mafia drug cartel, and yeah, he was more than happy to help. Federal documents imply that Sin City Mafia actually moved just as much cocaine as the BMF, and they probably had the same LA supplier, used the same basic corporate approach, and even had a tight alliance with the BMF. And just like Meech, J-Rock aspired to also work in the music industry, but he thought a little bit bigger. He started Bogard Records, which was housed inside Platinum Recording, a state-of-the-art recording studio that J-Rock had built and that nobody was using. Luckily for J-Rock, he made enough money in his illegal cocaine trafficking to fund the $30,000 a month cost of running a studio that nobody uses. There was one major difference between the Sin City Mafia and the BMF, though. J-Rock and many of his associates in his crew were quick to extreme violence, a fact that Kiki and Scott had been first-hand witnesses of. A year or so into their business arrangement, while on a trip to the NBA All-Star Game with several members of the Sin City Mafia, Kiki and Scott ended up spending about half their trip hiding from police after a traffic argument erupted into gunshots and people lying dead in the street. Scott and Kiki viewed themselves as businessmen, not gangsters. But the supply was reliable, really high quality, and so they knew it came with the territory. By 2001, Kiki wanted to start laundering his money and give the impression, at least on paper, that he was a respectable businessman that should be able to afford all of the things that he had. Once again, he partnered with Scott King to form a car dealership and accessories store on the outskirts of Buckhead called 404 Motorsports. The business was a great way to clean money. Bentleys and rims can be expensive and have a lot of non-specific service charges that no one has to explain to the IRS. By all appearances, it was a pretty successful business. The walls were lined with signed jerseys from Braves and Browns players who claimed to be customers. Also adding to the legitimacy was the company that Kiki was keeping. He just happened to be dating, and would soon be marrying, Kai Franklin. Kai was the daughter of Atlanta political juggernaut and 2001 mayoral winner, Shirley Franklin. The guy was dating the mayor's daughter. And things were going well. That was until 2003, when it was clear that 404 Motorsports was struggling to stay afloat, let alone make enough money to clean the drug money that they were actually making. Adding to the pressure, Kiki and Kai bought a $600,000 house, and Kai was known to come home with new furs and jewelry without consulting her husband. Luckily, J-Rock had a solution and introduced him to a friend of his named Terry Flannery. Terry was looking to make some investments, and he agreed to give Kiki $250,000, which in return would make him a part owner of the business. While it didn't solve 404's laundering problem, it was at least enough money to pay the lease and keep the lights on while they figured out something else. So, in early 2003, Kiki met Terry at a big white house south of the city and loaded bands of cash into a secret compartment in his car. But this was a decision that Kiki quickly came to regret. By April, Terry was beginning to grow impatient with the lack of returns on his investment and was demanding money. But Kiki didn't have any. Instead, he offered him a pair of Porsches valued at about $100,000 each. Terry agreed, and Kiki put the cars in his wife Kai's name and had her sign the financing, without her even knowing what she was signing. Scott King, Kiki's partner in drugs and cars alike, had even bigger problems. Back in 2002, a guy named Baron Johnson became a person of interest to the Greenville, South Carolina Vice Squad. They set up some undercover buys and from there got a wiretap. It wasn't long before they learned that Baron was actually getting his cocaine from a guy named Scott King in Atlanta, and his associate, Ulysses Hackett, was the driver. The police took this information into the DEA to see if any of it was interesting, and it turned out it was very interesting, and their buddies the IRS were pretty interested too. By December 2003, Baron Johnson, Scott King, and Ulysses Hackett were indicted under seal in federal court in Greenville. They were charged with conspiracy to distribute cocaine and to launder drug money. Baron was picked up immediately, and when he saw what they had on him, he flipped. On January 21, 2004, Baron called up Scott King and requested 4 kilos. King, not knowing Baron had been arrested, did what he always did. He sent Hack with the package to meet at Kiki's house. Though he never made it to the house. Hack was picked up on the way and charged. Lucky for Scott, Hack's girlfriend learned of the arrest and warned him that he was likely next. The indictment was unsealed and confirmed that the police were indeed looking for him, so Scott did what anyone would. He used a fake ID to fly to California and start a new life. It just so happened J-Rock had also relocated to Los Angeles as well and had a number of homes that Scott could stay in. King spent some time living in the $2 million home that was just a shouting distance from Terry's stash house, known as First Base. The Sin City crew hung out nearby at a house dubbed Second Base, and most of the drugs were at Third Base, a house so far outside the city few would actually consider it Los Angeles anymore. While Barron didn't know enough to flip on Kiki, Hack did, and he was becoming more convinced that he would. Feeling paranoid, he flew out to Los Angeles to visit J-Rock and propose an idea. Up to that point, J-Rock had gotten his drugs and money back and forth from Los Angeles to Atlanta via a private plane and a very trusted courier. You have to remember, we're talking about a lot of cocaine, or on the return trip, as much as $4 million. So you better have somebody who can handle themselves if things start to go sideways. Kiki had an idea that removed all the risk. Dubbed the Graham method after its inventor, Kiki Graham, was simple. Pack the cocaine into 70-pound cardboard boxes with a fake destination in Atlanta and a fake return address in Los Angeles. For anyone curious, those boxes were worth about $500,000 wholesale and probably about $4 million on the street. Then, take those boxes down to the local UPS and ship them to Atlanta. When the boxes arrived, they were carefully set aside by an inside man. The insider was friends with a man named Ernest E. Watkins. Kiki was paying Watkins to make the pickup and orchestrate the intercept at the UPS sorting facility. No one knew the UPS inside man, only Ernest. From the first run, the plan worked exactly as expected, and by the spring of 2004, UPS saw a very dramatic increase in shipments between Los Angeles and Atlanta. Kiki would fly to Los Angeles to oversee the packing, and then follow the shipment a few days later to pick up the shipment from Ernest. For his part, J-Rock would pay Kiki $60,000 per trip for overseeing it. The Graham method was almost risk-free and made Kiki enough money to keep 404 afloat, at least for the time being. That was until he got a call from his wife while out in Los Angeles preparing a shipment. Apparently, the DEA was at the house with a search warrant, and they were ripping the place apart. Kiki had been added to Scott and Hack's indictment. Among the agents executing the search was Agent J. Raji, who had been the lead interrogator when they picked up Hack. From there, he met up with Agent Jack Harvey, who was knee-deep in his investigation into the BMF. The two realized there was a good amount of overlap and joined forces. While at the house, the agents collected a number of things, including a receipt for a storage shed rented by somebody named Ernest Watkins, a name that was meaningless to the investigators at the time. Back in LA, Kiki and Scott discussed whether to return and face the charges or take their chances and run. Scott was firmly in camp fugitive, but Kiki was convinced that it wasn't that big of a deal. He was the mayor's son-in-law, for God's sake. He'd probably get community service if the charges stuck at all. So Kiki went back 2 weeks later and surrendered to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Atlanta. But he was really wrong about getting any special treatment for being married to the mayor's daughter. He was charged and released on a $300,000 bond with an ankle monitor and house arrest. When he got out, Kiki wasted no time in spinning up the shipments again, desperate for money. He ran them from his house with J-Rock's old courier Mookie doing the actual shipping and pickups. Mookie had become close to Kiki and felt bad for him. They would talk for hours on burner phones, more as friends than actual smugglers. Kiki was angry that J-Rock wasn't paying more of his legal fees after all the money he had made him, and Mookie agreed. So they came up with a plan to make things a little more even. Mookie lied to his boss J-Rock about needing a couple days off and came to Atlanta. There he met Kiki and Ernest, the guy with the UPS connection. Kiki packed 2 suitcases with cash and sent them on a private plane back to Los Angeles with Mookie and Ernest. Then, Ernest was to buy as much cocaine as he possibly could and ship it back to Atlanta using the UPS method. But this time, the coke would be all Kiki's, and J-Rock didn't need to know anything about it. At the same time Kiki was going behind J-Rock's back, he also began to try to manipulate him into solving the Hack problem. Kiki believed Hack was the only thing tying him directly to the drugs, and would constantly remind J-Rock that there was that one time that Hack dropped cash off directly to J-Rock when he and Scott weren't around. Kiki was convinced Hack was going to take a plea deal and sell them all out, including J-Rock, unless something was done about it. On September 4th, 2004, Scott King was awakened to a phone call on his latest burner. It was late, but it was Kiki, and a man on the run can't afford to miss a phone call, although he would really wish he missed this one. The call was brief, and the message was clear. Stupid and the girl are dead. I'll call with more details later. And he hung up. In the hour just before sunrise, 2 men had kicked in the door, run up the stairs, and shot Hack and his girlfriend Misty Carter in the head before fleeing. Misty had just returned from San Diego on a trip with her family, while her father, a vascular surgeon, attended a conference. Her mother Katie had been worried about her daughter's boyfriend and his suspicious trips to and from South Carolina, but Misty assured her there was nothing to worry about. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Scott wasn't surprised to get the call. Kiki had acquired a gun some time ago and approached him about taking out Hack. Scott refused, disgusted by the idea, having known him for almost 20 years, and viewing him as a brother. Kiki backed off, but Scott knew he just started badgering J-Rock about it instead. And if he was successful at convincing J-Rock Hack was a threat, there would be no hesitation to take him out. Meanwhile, over in the BMF camp, they were dealing with their own crisis. On October 20th, 2004, the DeKalb County Police Department had arrested Big Meech. Okay, guys, that's where we're going to call it this week. We'll be back with part 2 of Big Meech and the Black Mafia Family. I hope you're enjoying it. It's not as music-centric as I mentioned at the top, but still quite interesting, I thought. As always, if you can, rate, review, subscribe, follow, whatever they're calling it. If you can, go to the Apple iTunes app. Give us the 5 stars. Drop a really weird review in there. We'll enjoy it. Tim will be back here shortly. He's just off doing Tim things. You can reach out to us on Instagram. That's hatePod. Twitter's album hatePod. I'm G Harvey Tweets on Twitter. We have Discord servers. We have subreddits. We have all the ways to contact us. You can also email us directly at hatePodMail@gmail.com. You can email us anonymously by going to hatepod.com and clicking contact us in the upper left-hand corner. That does ask for an email. That's just so we can reply back to you. You can put in a fake one if you want, but if you do, I just don't know why you'd bother. And we will reply. Hope you enjoy it. We'll be back next week with part number 2. For Why I Hate This Album, I have been your only host, Garrett Harvey.
There's cowboys running through my dreams. Nothing's quite the way it seems. I joined the Navy, got kicked out in a week. My facial features aren't distinct. Try to find some meaning in these songs. The genius is a genius, got it wrong. No, it's a lobster murder sex thing. It's the bleaching of the rear. A full assault on both your ears. Riffs are too repetitive, the lyrics make no sense. All the songs are B-sides, the cover art's a mess. Listen to it for a week, now that week has passed. It's the Why I Hate This Album podcast with Tim and Garrett.